Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales, where we read old folktales and fairy tales by Fireside every Tuesday night, Fairy Tale Tuesday. My name is Rory and you're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube channel. If you've never been here before and you do like what you see tonight, consider subscribing. But we did just reach over 100 subscribers, and I do want to say up front, thank you for that. A lot of that was people who enjoy Fireside Fairytales. I'm very touched, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do about it, but I just wanted to say up front that I really appreciate that. What we're going to read tonight, though, is we're going to continue on a little bit from last week. Last week we watched or read some German folktales about dragons. And this week we're going to be looking at stories that have dragons featuring in it that come from Asbjornsen and Moe's collection. If you've never been here before, we've been reading, sort of going back and forth between reading Juergen Hübert's collection, Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which is a collection of a bunch of German folklore, recently translated to English by Juergen Hübert. And then we go back and forth to Simon Roy Hughes, who is translating Asbjornsen and Moe, who were collectors. They're sort of the Grimm brothers of Norway, and they collect Norwegian folktales, and Simon is translating those. And so what we're going to read tonight is some translations from Simon Roy Hughes. If you've never been here before, down in the description below, if you're not watching this live, there will be timestamps, and you can jump ahead to the stories. We're going to read 2 stories tonight. We're probably going to run a little long, which is okay with me. The worst thing that happens is my throat sometimes gets a little dry at the end, but that's about it. But just so you know, it was sort of a case of one story was too short and 2 stories was a bit long, and I decided I'd rather do more than less. We're going to read 2 stories. One is called The Boy Who Changed Himself into a Lion, a Falcon, and an Ant, which is a Norwegian folktale collected by Asbjornsen and Moe. Also collected by Asbjornsen and Moe. Our second story will be The Golden Castle That Hung in the Air, also a Norwegian traditional tale, both translated by Simon Roy Hughes, who, if you're not watching live, there will be a pinned comment with links to ways of supporting Simon Roy Hughes' efforts to translate these works to English, which you should absolutely support. But also, I'm going to put some links down there to some articles that I'm going to reference today, because there's a little bit of learning we're going to do ahead of time. It's a very packed night in that sense. So if you just want to get to the stories and you're not watching this live, check in the description below. There'll be a little timestamp, gets you to the beginning of the first story or the second story, whichever you prefer. For those who are sticking it out here or who are watching live, there's a couple of things I want to say. The first question that a person who knows a bit about folklore, especially Asbjornsen and Moe collections, knowing that I'm talking about dragons and drakes and lintworms and all of that kind of stuff, might ask, are we going to read Prince Lintworm? Because it is often accredited to Asbjornsen and Moe as a Norwegian tale collected by them. If you don't know this, this won't mean anything to you. But if you have heard that, I'm going to, in that pinned comment below, link an article from Simon Roy Hughes, our translator tonight, that explains how Prince Lintworm is not collected. It's not even a Norwegian tale. I'll let him give you the details, but we're not reading it tonight because we are reading Norwegian tales specifically, and yeah, it's not. The other thing I'm going to add is more a interesting fact. Our first story, the boy who changed himself into a lion, a falcon, and an ant. The boy is named... Let's try to find the example here. Or maybe it's our second story where he's named. Let me double check that. Yes. So the golden castle that hung in the air, there's no one named in The Boy Who Changed. That's right. In the second story, Golden Castle That Hung in the Air, there's a boy named Askeladden, which, if you put that into Google Translate, as I did, it translates to Cinderella, which was confusing to me. And so I messaged Simon and I asked, what is going on? Why does it say it's Cinderella? And he gave a very interesting answer that it links to another article he wrote. And I'm not going to go into too much depth about it, because he does a good job explaining Askeladden, which translates quite literally to the ash lad. And it refers to a person who blows to keep the embers of the fire going, which really is a way of speaking to like a job reserved to the lowest in the household. And I guess that's kind of where Cinderella gets her name from as well. She's sort of the lowest in the household. She's the cinder, cinders in a fire, Ella, as in like a female. I just find that fact interesting. Apparently, Askeladden is the name, when they chose to name them, often used by Asbjornsen and Moe as just sort of the name for the male protagonist in a lot of these tales, because in various regions they are given different names. So they just picked one that they liked. But the article itself, called The Ash Lad, will be linked in the pinned comment to Simon Roy Hughes' explanation on that. So, with that said, my final disclaimer is the disclaimer I always give about when we're talking about magical creatures like dwarves and pixies and kobolds and dragons and whatever else, is they just are not categorized ahead of time in folklore. So we're going to see some things called lintworms, and we're going to see some things called dragons, and it's kind of not very consistent as to why they're called that. I will say in general, lintworms is flightless, but otherwise are the same as dragons. But then again, not always. There are lintworms we saw last week that fly. So it doesn't really matter what they're called, because it's not a taxonomy done on a very specific creature over many years. There's stories told in the countryside. And so with that said, and because we have quite a bit of reading today, we're also going to have a couple of notes from Juergen Hübert at the end of the these two stories. I do not want to waste much more time, yours or mine. I want to get us to our stories. So our first story of the night is called The Boy Who Changed Himself into a Lion, a Falcon, and an Ant. And it comes from a collection by Asbjornsen and Moe, but translated most recently by Simon Roy Hughes. And let's get ourselves a little bit of wind. There was once a man who had an only son, but he lived in want and destitution. When he lay on his deathbed, he told his son that he owned nothing but a sword, a sackcloth garment, and some breadcrumbs. And that is what he would inherit. After the man died, the boy wanted to try his luck out in the world. So he girded himself with the sword, made a package of the breadcrumbs in the sackcloth, for they lived up on a forested hillside far from other folk. Following the road, he had to cross a mountain. And when he had risen so high that he could see out across the tundra, he saw a lion, a falcon, and an ant. It stood arguing over a dead horse. Well, the boy grew afraid when he saw the lion, but it called to him and said that he should come and settle the argument between them, dividing the horse such that each, the lion, the falcon, and the ant, would get what they deserved. Well, the boy took his sword and divided the horse as best he can. Pardon me. To the lion he gave the carcass and the largest portion. To the falcon he gave some of the guts and other small parts. And to the ant he gave the head. When he had done this, he said, "Now I think it is fairly divided. The lion shall have the most, for he is largest and strongest. The falcon shall have the best, for he is fine and discerning. The ant shall have the head, for he crawls in nooks and crannies." Yes, they were all of them satisfied with their share, and asked him what he would have for dividing so well among them. "If I've done you a favor and you are satisfied, then I too am well satisfied," he said. "I do not want any payment." Yes, but he would be paid, they said. "Even if you want nothing," said the lion, "then you shall have 3 wishes." But the boy did not know what he should wish for. Then the lion asked him if he wouldn't want to be able to change into a lion, golden-maned and sharp-toothed. And the other 2 asked if they wouldn't want to change into a falcon, glorious, soaring on the wind, and an ant. I mean, a falcon and a lion. An ant. That could be well and good, he thought, and so he wished for it. And he cast away his sword and sackcloth and turned himself into a falcon and set off flying. He flew until he came over a large lake, but when he began to cross it, his wings grew so tired and sore that he could not fly any further. And when he saw a sheer mountain that rose up on the water, he lighted onto it to rest and thought it a strange mountain and walked upon it for a while. There's a nice picture of the mountain. If you are hard of sight, though, it's just a fairly standard mountain in black and white sketch art. After he had rested, he turned himself into a falcon again and flew off until he came to a king's farm, where he lighted in a tree outside the windows of the king's daughter, and when she saw the bird, she desired to capture it. So she lured it in, and when the falcon had come inside, she stood ready, and swoosh, she slammed the window shut and took the bird and put it into a cage. Well, during the night, the boy turned into that little itty-bitty ant and crawled out of the cage, and then he turned into who he really was and went over and sat beside the king's daughter. And she grew so afraid she began to scream, so that the king awoke and came in and asked her what was going on. "There's someone here!" she screamed. Meanwhile, the boy turned himself back to an itty-bitty little ant, crept into the cage, and turned himself into a falcon. Once again. Well, the king couldn't see anybody to be afraid of, so he said to his daughter that it must have been the nightmare pressing her. But the king had hardly closed the door before things went the same way again. The boy crept out of the cage as that little itty-bitty ant, but then he turned into who he was, a full-sized boy, and sat with the king's daughter. She screamed loudly, and the king came again to see what was going on. "There's someone here!" she screamed. But the boy hurried into the cage again and sat there as a falcon. While the king looked and searched both high and low, and when he did not find anything, he grew angry that he was not allowed peace during the night. He said that she was speaking nonsense. Typical man. "If you scream at me like that once more," he said, "you will be sorry that the king is your father." But the king had hardly closed the door before the boy was with the king's daughter again. This time she did not scream, even though she was so afraid that she didn't know what to do with herself. Oh, and there's some fine art. Suki says, gaslighting at its finest. To be fair, the boy's doing the gaslighting, not the king. The boy asked her what she was so afraid of. Well, she explained she was betrothed to a mound troll, and the first time she ventured beneath an open sky, he would come to take her, and when the boy came, she thought it was the mound troll. As if it wouldn't be enough reason to be scared just because some stranger was in your room. Every Thursday morning, a messenger came from the mound troll, and the messenger was a dragon that the king had to give 9 well-fed pigs, 1 for each of its heads, every time it came. He therefore declared that whosoever could free him from the dragon should have the king's daughter and half his kingdom. Pardon me. The boy said that he would do so, and when it grew light in the morning, the king's daughter went to the king and said that there was someone inside who would free him from the dragon and the pig tax. And the king was glad when he heard this, for the dragon had eaten up so many pigs that soon there would be none left in the whole kingdom. The day happened to be a Thursday morning, and therefore the boy hurried to the place where the dragon would be. Specifically where he would usually receive the pigs, and the head farmer of the king's farm showed him the way. Well, the dragon came too. And was so furious and angry that he spat fire and flames. And when he did not see the fodder of pigs, he charged at the boy as if he would eat them alive. But whoosh, the boy turned himself into a lion and fought with the dragon. and ripped one head off after the other. But the dragon was strong too, and he vomited fire and sparks. But as the battle drew on, it had no more than one head left, and this one, well, it was the toughest. So circling each other, the boy as a lion drew up his claws and at last ripped off that one too. And then it was over for the dragon. Then he went to the king, and there was great rejoicing in the whole king's farm, and the boy should have the king's daughter. Now one day as they were walking in the garden, the mound troll himself came faring, took the king's daughter, and left, flying through the air with her, as he had promised he would do. And the boy wanted to go after her immediately, but the king said he should not do so, for he had no one left now that he had lost his daughter. But neither command nor supplication helped. The boy turned himself into a falcon and left. And when he could not see them, he remembered the strange and sheer mountain that he had rested on the first time he had flown out. He let himself down there and sat there, turned himself into an ant, and crept through a crack in the rock. When he crept for a while, he came to a door that was locked. But he knew how to get in. He crept through the keyhole, and there sat an unfamiliar king's daughter, nitpicking. A mound troll with 3 heads. I have come the right way, thought the boy to himself. For he had heard the king had lost 2 daughters to the trolls before this 3rd. Perhaps I shall find the other one as well, he said to himself. And staying a tiny little ant, he crept through the keyhole of another door. There sat another unfamiliar king's daughter, nitpicking the mound troll with 6 heads. Then he crept through yet another keyhole, at yet another door, and there he finally sat, the youngest king's daughter, the one he knew well, nitpicking a mound troll with 9 heads. Well, he crawled up on her leg and pinched her, so she would understand that it was the boy who wanted to talk to her, which is quite the gamble, frankly, because if something pinched my leg and it was an ant, it's getting slapped and killed. Then she asked the mound troll's leave to go out a little. And so when he granted her it and she came out, the boy became himself again and told her to ask the mound troll if she never would be allowed to return to her father. And then he turned himself back into an ant and sat on her foot. Then the king's daughter went in again and resumed nitpicking the mound troll. After she'd done this for a while, she fell into thought.
You are forgetting to nitpick me. What are you thinking about? Said the troll.
Oh, I'm wondering whether I will ever leave yet. Go home to my father's farm, said the king's daughter.
No, you never will, said the mound troll. Not before someone finds the grain of sand that lies beneath the 9th tongue in the 9th head of the dragon that your father paid his tax to. But no one will ever find it. For should that grain of sand come over the mountain, then all the mound trolls shall burst, and the mountain shall turn into a gilded palace, and the lake into meadows.
When the boy heard this, he crept through all the keyholes and through the crack in the rock. And he then turned himself into, once again, a falcon. And he flew to where the dragon's head and its body had lain after he had slaughtered it as a lion. And he searched, and wouldn't you know it, he found that single grain of sand under the 9th tongue and the 9th head, the one that was the toughest to remove, and he flew off with it. But when he returned to the lake, he grew weary. So weary that he had to glide down and light on a stone on the beach, and as he sat there, his eyes grew heavy. He lost his focus, and he closed them for just a moment. Yet it was long enough that the grain of sand fell out of his beak and down among the sand on the beach. So now he had to find a piece of sand on a beach. Well, he searched and searched. For 3 days he searched, night and day, unerring in his focus. And he found it again. And when he had found it, he flew directly up to that sheer mountain away from the lake. And he dropped it down through the crack, as the troll had advised her not to do. And then, well, all the trolls burst. And there stood, as the mountain cracked away, a gilded palace, which was the most beautiful place in the whole world. And the lake was the most beautiful fields and greenest meadows anyone had ever seen. Or shall ever see. And so then they traveled, the daughters and this boy who turned into a falcon, an ant, and a lion, together back to the king's farm, and there was rejoicing and glory. The boy and the youngest king's daughter had each other, and they celebrated the wedding across the whole kingdom for 7 whole weeks. And if they fare not well, then perhaps you may fare better. That is the boy who changed himself into a lion, a falcon, and an ant. One of the things, before I go on to the next story, one of the things that I particularly enjoy about that story is it breaks with a certain tradition in these tales. And the tradition is, normally, when you get an item or a thing, it only comes up for one event. So you'll get like golden yarn, and then there will be some, horse will be like, only those with golden yarn can pass. And then he shows the golden yarn, and then it never comes up again. But this was interesting because it many times used the premise of him turning into a falcon, an ant, and a lion. And I find that personally more satisfying. Although I do like the absurdity of like when just random nonsense, like you need a thimble and a darning needle that bends to the east, and it's never really any real good reason why it's so specific. There is some charm to that. Okay. So our next tale is actually a little bit longer. So we'll see how long it takes, because we're at about 1/2 past exactly. So that's why I think we'll finish a little late here, but no worries. This tale is called The Golden Castle That Hung in the Air, and it was collected by Asbjornsen and Moe, but translated most recently by Simon Roy Hughes, and we will be reading Simon Roy Hughes' translation this evening. It follows some similar structures to the first story. It follows some similar structures to stories that we've read on this channel before, because that's kind of how folk and fairy tales go. So this is The Golden Castle That Hung in the Air, collected by Asbjornsen and Moe, translated by Simon Roy Hughes. There was once upon a time a poor man who had 3 sons, and when he died, the elder 2 should go out into the world, and they tried their luck. But they would not, by any means, have the youngest with them. "You," they said, "you are good for nothing but sitting there, holding fat wood candles and digging in the ashes, blowing in the embers you are."
"Indeed, well, I shall go by myself alone, then," said Askeladden. "And I will not fall into any disagreement with my traveling companions either."
And so the 2 older brothers went on their way, and when they had traveled for some days, they came to a great forest. There they sat down to rest and to take of the food they had packed, for they were both weary and hungry, too. And as they sat, an old woman came up through a tussock and asked for a little food, just a bit. She was so old and frail that her mouth quivered and her head shook, and she had to walk with a stick. She had not had a crumb of bread in her mouth in 100 years, she said. But the boys, the 2 older brothers, they just laughed and ate and said that since she'd survived so long, then she would survive the rest, even without eating up their crumbs. And they had but little food and none to lose on some old lady in a tussock. Well, when they had both eaten long and good and rested, they set off again, and at great length and distance they came to the king's farm. There they went into service, the both of them. A while after they had left home, Askeladden gathered together the crumbs his brother had left behind, put them in a small knapsack, and he took them with him the old gum that was left unlocked, for he thought it would always be good to have it with him on the road. And then he set off, just as his brothers had. And when he had walked for some days, he came into a great forest that his brothers had earlier gone through. And since he grew both weary and hungry, he sat beneath a tree to rest and have a little to eat. But he had his wits about him, and when he took out his food, he saw a portrait hanging on a tree which depicted a young maiden, perhaps a princess, whom he thought was so gorgeous that he could not take his eyes off it. He forgot his food, his knapsack, took down the portrait and laid it down and gazed upon it. And just like that, the old woman came up the tussock, as she had before, with her lip quivering, her head shaking, and walking with a stick. She asked for some food, for she had not had a crumb of bread in her mouth these last 100 years, she said. "Well, perhaps it's time you had a little to live on then, old mother," said the boy, giving her some of the breadcrumbs he had. The woman said that no one in 100 years had called her mother, and she would surely do him a mother's deed in return, she said. And so she gave him a ball of gray yarn, which he should merely roll before him, and he would come to wherever he wanted to go. But he should not mind the portrait of the princess or the maiden that he had found upon the tree, she said. That would only get him into trouble on its account. Askeladden thought this all well and good, but he would not be without the portrait. So he put it under his arm, rolled the ball of woolen yarn before him, and it was not long before he came to the king's farm where his brothers were in service. He too asked to go into service, but they replied they had no use for him, for they'd recently taken on 2 footmen. But he asked so beautifully that at last he was allowed to go to the stable master to be trained to look after the horses. Askeladden was willing, for he liked horses. He was good. He was good and clever at it. So he soon learned to brush and groom them, and it was not long before everyone in the king's farm held him dear. But he spent every free moment he had gazing upon that portrait of that beautiful girl. He'd hung it on a hook over the hayloft where he rested. Well, his brothers, on the other hand, were sleepy and lazy, and thus they often received harsh words and blows. And when they saw things went better with Askeladden than themselves, they grew envious of him, and told that head groom that Askeladden was an idolater, that he prayed to a picture and not our Lord. Well, even though the head groom liked Askeladden, it was not long before he had to tell the king. But the king, for his part, merely ranted and raved at him. He was now nothing but sullen and mournful, for the king's daughter had been taken by a troll. But they trumped in the king's ears for so long that he wanted to discover what the boy was about. And so when he came up to the hayloft and saw the portrait, the king realized immediately that his youngest daughter was painted on it. Gonna have a drink of water. One moment. Now, when Askeladden's brothers heard this, they were soon ready to say to the head groom, "If our brother wanted to, he has said he is good to return the king's daughter to him." You may imagine it was not long before the head groom went to the king with that. The king called for Askeladden and said, "Your brothers say that you can return my daughter, and now you shall do it." Askeladden replied that he had never known it was the king's daughter before the king had said so himself. And if he could save her and fetch her, then he would certainly do his best, but that he needed 2 days in which to prepare himself and equip himself. And so the king said this he could certainly have. One of my favorite tropes is the king just hiring random strangers. There's the boy following his little ball of yarn. If you are hard of sight, it's a grayscale drawing of a boy kicking some yarn before him, and he's got a gun slung over his shoulder. The boy took out the ball of gray woolen yarn and threw it on its way. And it went before him, and he came after until he came to the old woman from whom he had originally received it. He asked her what he should do, and she said that he should take his old gun with him. And check out this shopping list, because this was really where the story grabbed me personally. 300 crates of nails and horseshoe-nails, and 300 barrels of meal, and 300 pigs and 300 bull carcasses, and then roll the ball of yarn on his way until he met a crow and a troll child. How is he carrying all this? A bull is like 800 pounds or something. For then he would certainly reach forth, for they were of her kin. So the boy did what she said. He went to the king's farm, and he took his old gun and asked the king for the meat and flesh, and horses, and boys and vehicles to carry it. Which, by the way, never come up again. It's just assumed he has it. The king thought it was a lot to have need of, but if he could return his daughter, then he would have anything he demanded, even if it were half the kingdom. When the boy had equipped himself, he rolled the ball of yarn on his way, and he had not walked for many days before he came to a tall mountain, and there he saw a crow sitting up on a pine tree. Ascalon went up under the tree and began to aim and point the gun when the crow said,
"No! Don't shoot! Don't shoot me! I shall help you!"
cried the crow. "I've never heard anyone boast of roast crow," said the boy. "Since you value your life, then I may just as well spare you." So he threw down his gun, and the crow flew down and said,
Up here on the mountain is a young troll child who has got so lost that he cannot find his way down again. I shall help you up, and then you can take the child home and receive a reward that you may now well need. When you get there, the troll will offer you anything from the finest things he has, but you shall not take nothing other than the gray ass that stands behind the stable door.
And so the crow was good to his word, and took the boy on his back, and flew up the mountain, and set him down there. And when he had walked a little, he heard the troll child whining and complaining that he could not get down again. Well, the boy spoke kindly enough to him, and they became friends and liked each other. And he took it upon himself to help him down. And so he should take the troll child home to the troll garden, and so he could not get lost on the way home. They went to the crow, and he took them on his back, and both of them, and carried them to the mountain troll. When the troll saw his child again, he was so glad he forgot himself, and said to the boy that he could come in, take whatever he wanted, for he had saved his only son. He was offered both gold and silver and everything rare and costly, but the boy said he would rather have a horse. Yes, he should have a horse then, said the troll, and so they went to the stable, and it was full of the finest horses, which gleamed like the sun and the moon, but the boy thought every one of them too large for him. Then he peeked behind the stable door, and saw the gray ass standing there. "This I will have," he said, "for it suits me. If I fall off, then it is not further to the ground than this." Well, the troll was reluctant to lose his ass, but since he had said it, then he had to stand by it. So the boy got the ass with saddle and bridle and everything that went with it, and then set off on his way. And they traveled through forest and wilderness, over mountains and broad heaths. And when they had traveled farther than far, the ass asked if the boy saw anything. "No, I see nothing but a tall mountain on the horizon," said the boy. "Yes, we shall pass through that mountain," said the ass. "Really?" said the boy. And when they came to the mountain, a unicorn charged them as if it would eat them alive, and spear them, I imagine, on its horn. "I think I'm also afraid," said the boy. "Don't be," said the ass.
Unload 20 bull carcasses, and bid it bore a hole. Clear away through the mountain, it said.
So the boy did so, throwing 40 bull carcasses. Cannot emphasize how heavy bulls are. And how big is this unicorn that it can eat 40 bull carcasses? When the unicorn had eaten itself satisfied, yeah, I bet, they promised 40 more slaughtered pigs if it would go before them and bore a hole in the mountain so that they could get through. Well, when it heard this, it bored a hole and cleared away through the mountain so quickly that they could hardly keep up. And when it was finished, they threw 20 pigs to it. What an image. Just 40 pigs thrown into the mud before one basically horse. After they had come well from this, they traveled far away through the countries and went across forest and wilderness, over mountains and wild heaths again. "Do you see anything now?" asked the ass. "Now I see nothing but sky and wild mountains," said the boy. And so they traveled far and farther than far, and as they came higher up, the mountain grew flatter, more even. They could see widely around them.
"Do you see anything now?" said the ass.
"Yes, I see something far, far away," said the boy. "It glitters and shines like a small star."
"It is certainly not so small," said the ass.
When they had traveled far and farther than far again, it asked,
"Can you see something now?"
"Yes, now I see something far away. It shines like a moon," said the boy.
"That's no moon," said the ass. "It is the silver castle we are going to," it said. "And when we arrive, 3 dragons lie guard by the gate. They have not awoken in 100 years, so moss has grown upon their eyes."
"I think I shall almost be afraid of them," said the boy.
"Don't be," said the ass. "You must wake the youngest and throw him 20 bull carcasses and slaughtered pigs, and then you'll talk to the other 2, and then you will get into the castle."
And so they traveled far and farther than far before they arrived at the castle. And when they had arrived, it was big and fine, and everything they saw was cast in silver. And outside the gate, well, there lay 3 dragons. Blocking it so no one could get in. They'd been left in peace and quiet and had not been bothered on their watch, and they were so covered in moss that no one could see what they were made of. Between them grew 2 small patches of forest among the moss. So as directed by the ass, the boy woke the smallest of them, and it began to rub its eyes to clear away the patches of moss. And when the dragon saw that here were folk, it came towards them with its mouth wide. But the boy stood ready and threw the bull carcasses and hurled the pigs into it until it had eaten enough and grew a little more reasonable to talk with. Well, the boy asked it to wake the others and asked them to move away so that he could go into the castle, but it dared not and would not, said the dragon. They had not been awake and had not tasted food for 100 years. It was afraid they would move around in a daze and gobble everything up, be it alive or dead, maybe even himself. Well, the boy thought there should be no danger, for they could leave 100 bull carcasses and 100 slaughtered pigs and move away a little. so they could eat themselves full and pull themselves together before the youngest dragon would return and propose to let them through. Yes, the dragon wanted this as well, and thus they did so. And before the dragons were fully awake and had rubbed the moss from their eyes, they stumbled about in a daze, snapping at this and that, until they'd eaten it all. The youngest dragon had work enough to do in avoiding them until they'd eaten enough meat. And then they swallowed down the whole bowl and pig carcasses and ate until they were satisfied. And then they grew quite placid and good-natured and let the boy go between them into the castle. Everything in the castle was so fine there that he'd never imagined such finery. But it was empty of folk, for he went from room to room and opened every door, and he saw no one. But yes, he peeped through a doorway into a chamber he had not yet seen. Inside sat a princess, spinning. She was happy and glad when she saw him. "No, no. Do Christian folk dare come here?" she cried. "It would be best you left again. The troll might kill you." For a great troll with 3 heads lives there. The boy said he would not remove himself, not even if the troll had 7 heads. And when the princess heard this, she wanted him to try to wield the great rusty sword that hung behind the door. Well, no. It was too big, too heavy. He could not wield it. He could not even lift it. "Well," said the princess, "since you cannot do it, then try taking a draught from the flask that hangs beside it, for that is what the troll does when he takes it out to use." Well, the boy took a couple of swigs, and then he could wield it as if it were a baker's stick. If you don't know what a baker's stick is, it's kind of what they used in like pizza ovens modern day, sort of a stick for getting bread out. Also, interestingly, this like strength draft and the sword over the drawer is a really common thing. I've seen this in at least 2 other tales we've read. Just like that, the troll swept in. "Here it smells of a Christian man," it screamed. "It does so," said the boy, "but even so, you don't need to snort out of your nose. You shan't be troubled by the smell for long," he said, drawing up the big rusty blade. Pardon me. He hacked off all its heads. Well, as it slumped over dead, the princess was as happy as if she had received something good. What an analogy. But as time passed, she grew sullen, for she yearned for her sister, who had been taken as well by a troll, but this one had 6 heads and lived in a castle of gold, 300 leagues beyond the end of the world. Well, the boy thought this was not so bad. He could fetch both the princess and the castle. And so he took the sword and the flask and mounted the ass and asked the dragons to come with him, bringing the meat and flesh and nails as he had left. And when they had been on their way for a while, and they had traveled far, far away across both land and strand, the ass said one day, "Do you see anything?" "I see nothing but land and water and sky and tall mountains," said the boy. And so they traveled far, and farther than far. "Do you see anything now?" said the ass. "Why, yes. The boy had seen something before him, he said.
Something far, far away. It shines like a small star, said the boy.
It will certainly grow bigger, said the ass.
And when they had traveled a long distance farther, it asked,
Do you see anything now?
Now I see it shines like a moon, said the boy.
Well, said the ass.
When they had traveled far, and farther than far, across land and strand, over mound and heath, again the ass asked,
Do you see anything now?
I think it shines almost like the sun, said the boy.
Yes, it is the golden castle we are going to, said the ass. But outside lies a lindworm that blocks the road and keeps guard.
I think I shall be scared, said the boy.
Oh, don't be, said the ass. We will bend layers of branches over it, place layers of horseshoe-nails between them, and light it all on fire until we are well rid of it.
And after a long, long time, they came to where the castle hung and the lindworm lay before it, blocking the road in. And so the boy gave the dragons a good number of bull and pig carcasses so that they would help him. And together they bent over a layer of branches, and then a layer of horseshoe-nails, until they'd used up the 300 cases that they had. And when that was done, they set it on fire and burned up the lindworm alive. And when they'd finished doing this, one dragon flew underneath and lifted the castle up upon its back, and the other two went far up into the sky and loosed the chain hooks that the castle hung upon, and put it all down on the ground. And when this was done, the boy went in, and here it was even finer than in the silver castle. But again, he saw no folk before he came to the innermost room. For in that room there lay a princess on a golden bed, and she slept so soundly that she might have been dead, but she was not. And even though he was not man enough to wake her, in case anyone doesn't know what that means, just let it be in your imagination. She was as red and white as milk and blood. Just as the boy stood there looking at her, the troll swept in. No sooner had it got its first head through the door when it said,
Huh? Here it smells of a Christian man.
Perhaps, said the boy. But you don't need to snort so hard through your nose. You shan't have the trouble of it for long, he said. And then he hacked off all of its heads as they were set on cabbage stalks. Then, as if they were set on cabbage stalks. And the dragon took the golden castle on their backs and went home with it. It didn't take them long, I should think, and placed it beside the silver castle so they gleamed both far and wide. And when the princess from the silver castle came to the window in the morning and saw it, she was so glad she ran over to the golden castle at this very same hour. And when she saw her sister, who lay sleeping as if she were dead, she said to the boy that they could not bring her back to life before they had the waters of death and life, and that these stood in two wells on each side of a golden castle that hung in the air 900 leagues beyond the end of the world, and in it there lived the third sister. Well, there was nothing else to do, said the boy. He would have to fetch her too, and it was not long before he was on his way, and he traveled far, and farther than far, through many kingdoms, through wilderness and forest, and across mountains and coasts, and over rocks and waves, until finally he came to the end of the world. And of course, with further to go, he traveled both far and farther than far, over heath and mound and lofty peaks beyond the end of the world, until finally one day the ass said, "Do you see anything?" "I see nothing but the sky and earth," said the boy. "Do you see anything now?" said the ass, when a few more days had passed since they last talked. "Yes, I think I can glimpse something high up and far away. It's like a small star," said the boy. "Certainly not so small," said the ass. And when they traveled for some days more, well beyond the end of the earth, it asked, "Do you see anything now?" "Yes, I think now it shines like the moon." "Indeed," said the ass. And so they traveled for some days more. "And do you see anything now?" asked the ass. "Yes, now it shines like the sun," replied the boy. "This is where we are going," said the ass. "It is the golden castle that hangs in the air. There lives a princess who has been taken by a troll with 9 heads. All the wild animals there are on earth lie guard there, blocking the way in," said the ass. I think I'm almost afraid now," said the boy. "Oh, don't be," said the ass. And then it explained that there would be no danger if the boy did not try to stop amongst the animals, but instead leave the castle again when he had filled his vessels with water. It was not passable, you see, for more than 1 hour. The animals were not passable for more than 1 hour of the day, which was during the high day, in modern parlance, noon. But if he was not man enough to be finished and get away during that time, then those animals would tear him into 1,000 pieces. Well, yes, the boy would do this. He certainly would not stop for too long either. And so they arrived at 12 o'clock, 900 leagues past the end of the earth, before a golden castle hanging in the sky. And there, as was predicted, lay all the wild and dangerous animals of the earth. Like a fence around the gate, and on both sides of the road, they slept like logs and rocks, and there was not one of them that even lifted a leg. And so the boy stepped carefully between them, making certain that he did not tread on toes or tips of tails. And finally, on the other side, he filled his vessels with the waters of life, and then the waters of death. And as he did so, his eye caught on this castle that was cast in gleaming gold. My God, it was the finest thing he had ever seen, and he thought it must be finer on the inside. I have time, he thought Askeladden. I could look around for half an hour. And so he opened up and went inside, and it was more beautiful than beautiful. He went from one stately room to the next. and it was all covered in gold and pearls and everything costly and beautiful. There were no folk there until he came into one chamber, where there lay a princess sleeping on a golden bed, as if she were dead. And she was as beautiful as the most beautiful queen, and as red and white as blood and snow, as beautiful as nothing he'd ever seen except for her portrait. For it was she who was depicted there, the one that hung in his hayloft. The boy forgot both the water he should fetch and the animals and all the castle, and gazed enraptured upon the princess. He thought he could never have enough of looking at her, but she slept as if she were dead, and he could not wake her. So when the evening drew on, the troll came sweeping in, banging and bumping into the gates and the doors so that the noise went through the castle. "Ugh! It smells of a Christian man," it said, sticking its first head in through the door, sniffing. "That may be," said the boy, "but you have no business of huffing so that you tear the bellows. You shall not have the trouble of the smell for long," he said, and with that he hacked off all its 9 heads. And when he was finished, he was overcome by fatigue. He could not keep his eyes open, and so he lay down on the bed beside the princess. And she slept both night and day, as if she would never wake. But at midnight, she was awake for just a moment, and she said to him that he had saved her, and that she had to remain there for 3 more years. If she did not come home to him, then he must come to fetch her. Well, he did not wake up again until it was past 1 o'clock on the following day. Uh-oh, he missed his window. And he could hear the ass braying and carrying on, and so he thought it best to start off on his way home. But first, he cut a fold from the princess's dress and took it with him. But however it did and did not happen, he had dawdled for so long that the animals had begun to awake. And by the time he had crawled up the hill, they surrounded him so that his situation looked hopeless. And the ass said he should drop a few waters of death upon them. And so, uncorking his bottle, he splattered it about, and they all fell down on the spot and moved not a limb more. And while they were on their way home, the ass said to the boy, "When you have won your honor and glory, you will see that you shall forget me and what I have done for you, and I shall be brought to my knees with hunger." "No, that would never happen," said the boy. But when he arrived with the water of life at the home of the princess, and splashed some drops on her sister so that she awoke, then you can be sure there was gladness and joy. Then they went home to the king, and he was so glad and happy because he had got them back, his daughters, his dear daughters, all but the one. And so he went around, still though longing and yearning for the 3 years to pass until his youngest daughter should come. And the boy who had fetched them, he became a powerful man. He was the first in the country beside the king. There were many who were envious that he had become such a great fellow. There was one, his name was the Red Knight, whom said they would have the eldest princess. He had her splash, the eldest princess, splash the water of death on that boy. And so he fell into a deep sleep. And when the 3 years were over, and it was some time into the 4th, a foreign ship came sailing, and the 3rd sister was aboard it. She had with her a 3-year-old child. And she sent a messenger up to the king's farm and said that he would not set foot ashore before they sent he who had been to the golden castle and saved her. So they sent one of the highest-ranking men on the king's farm, and when he came aboard, he struck his hat from his head and bent and bowed himself. "Can this be your father, my son?" said the princess to the 3-year-old child, who played with a golden apple. "No, my father does not crawl like a cheese maggot," said the boy child. And so they sent another of the same kind, who was the Red Knight. But things went no better for him than they had the first one. The princess set word with him that if they did not send the right one, then things would go badly with them. And when they heard this, they knew they had to wake the boy with the water of life. And when he awoke, he went down to the princess's ship. And he didn't bow too much, I wouldn't think. He just nodded his head. But he took out the fold that he had cut from her dress at the golden castle. "Here is my father," cried the boy, and giving him the golden apple he had been playing with. Then there was great joy and gladness across the whole kingdom, and the old king was happiest of them all, for his favorite daughter had come back. And when it was discovered what the Red Knight and the eldest princess had done to the boy, the king would have each of them rolled in a barrel. But Askeladden and the youngest princess interceded, and they were instead let off. Now there came a day, while they were celebrating the wedding on the king's farm, that the boy stood looking out the window. And it was at the beginning of spring, this was, and they were slipping the horses and the livestock, and the last to come out of the stable was the ass. It was so starved that it came out through the stall door on its knees. And then he felt so bad for forgetting about it that he went down, but he didn't know what good he could do for it. The ass said that the best he could do would be to chop its head off. And though he was loath to do it, the ass pleaded so nicely that he had to do it at last. And as soon as its head fell to the ground, an enchantment that had been cast on him came to an end, and there stood the most handsome prince that anyone would want to see. He got the second princess, and then they celebrated a wedding that was heard of and asked across the 7 kingdoms. And then they built houses. Then they patched shoes. Then they had princes, whenever they did choose. And that is the golden castle that hung in the air. And we are just about as over as I said we would be. And we aren't even done. But I want to say that I enjoyed both those stories. There's actually a third story that I also read for this week that I think was longer than both of them. But I might read it another time. I've got to decide what I want to do with it, because it is a thoroughly entertaining story, but it is brutal child abuse. And I've got to figure out how to frame that. I mean, the child gets even in the end, but I don't know if that necessarily makes it all better. Which means that it is time for a note from Juergen Hübert for our section called Translator's Notes. So Translator's Notes is the section where I read some comments from Juergen Hübert, or Simon if he ever wants to comment on a video. But Juergen, when we read his stories, gives us some notes. And I leave this screen up just so you know that it isn't my comments. I'm not taking credit for them. This comment comes from, I believe, I've forgotten which one it is. I think this one comes from the dwarf video we did a couple of weeks ago. I'm a little behind on his commentaries. And so Juergen wrote us to say, great show as always. Here is some commentary. The modern day approach to trying to categorize everything is a massive problem. We talked about this in the beginning of this show. And D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, for those who don't know, probably shares some of that blame. One of my favorite examples of this is when I saw someone claiming that dragons in Skyrim are technically wyverns because they only have 2 legs. And if you don't understand, this is me speaking for myself for a moment, if you don't understand why that's a bit silly, go watch some of the other videos. I mean, there isn't a consistent taxonomy where you can make claims like that. Juergen's commentary continuing. I wrote a rather lengthy essay on anti-Semitism in German folklore last year. I made the observation that, this is my commentary, I made the observation in that video that the image of dwarves being insidious, underhanded, greedy being the big thing, was a relatively recent phenomenon. You don't really see it in old folktales much. And that it was probably likely informed by the Ring Opera's portrayal, and the Ring Operas were written by a virulent anti-Semite, so that's why he's talking about anti-Semitism. Returning to Juergen's commentary, I wrote a rather lengthy essay on anti-Semitism in German folklore last year. While it contrasts these tropes with modern-day portrayals of goblins instead of dwarves, yeah, that's another one, I still feel it's relevant. You can find it on my website. I also linked it in a reply to this comment if you want to go back and find it. One trait of dwarves in folklore that is undeniably nasty is that they are the number one source of changelings, which is something we have seen on here before, but not for a while. Water spirits come second too, and nixies, where the child is switched out for an old dwarf. A book of dwarf tales is on my to-do list, although it is still a few years away. I really need to translate the tale about dwarf with geese feet sometime soon. Interesting. I suspect it was one of the inspirations for Castle Falkenstein's RPG. Some speculation about the origins of dwarves can be found in his collection, Juergen Hübert's collection, Further Tales of the Walls, though personally I find the line of argument to be dubious. We haven't, I think, read about walls much on here. It's part of the profession of shepherds that they had very little opportunity for entertainment. While farmers and farm employees would spend the evenings in the communal room and tell stories to each other, shepherds would spend the nights with their herds. Thus, perhaps they need to be more easily entertained. They tend to be more easily entertained than others just to stay sane. I was talking about how, in one of the stories, this is my commentary, I was talking about how the boy was particularly delighted by a bell, I think it was. And he just loved it so much. And I was like, how bored do you have to be this delighted by a bell? I visited Hübert near the town of Bad Grund last year. It's not a free climb rock, although there is a path to a spot close to the top with a great view. I mean, I'm a rock climber, if you guys didn't know that. I don't think it's ever come up before. I would guess, I did look it up, I would guess you could climb it. I suspect it has no anchors on it because it's a historical rock. We tend not to anchor them. But if you wanted to free solo it, pick a dry day, I guess. Nah, I'm not really a fan of free soloing. Okay, so that lengthy thing, of course, is the end of our translator's commentary. An unusually long show tonight, but it was 2 great stories, both of which featured dragons and one even a lindworm, which, according to Simon is the only occurrence of a lintworm in any of Asbjornsen and Moe's collection, which, by the way, I find surprising because, these are Norwegian tales, and the lintworm is pretty explicitly found in Nordic myth. It's a major, Fafnir is a big part of it. And so I would have expected to see more of that, but that's the cool thing about actually going and checking these sources and whatever. It's never quite what you expect. Thank you so much, Suki and GS, for hanging out with me in the chat. Remember, if you weren't here in the beginning or anything like that, remember a few things. If you haven't yet and you did enjoy this, please consider subscribing. We just passed 100 subscribers, and I am very touched by that development. Consider liking the video if it was a thing that you enjoyed. It helps the algorithm let other people like you know that this is worth watching. And finally, check the pinned comment when this video is no longer live to see the article from Simon Roy Hughes about the name Askeladden having roots with Cinderella. And and the article about how Prince Lindworm is not a Norwegian tale and is erroneously accredited to Asbjornsen and Moe. And maybe at some point we'll read Prince Lindworm. And of course, Simon Roy Hughes's Patreon will be linked there, and you should absolutely support it, because how cool is it to read these very finely translated stories? I've been Rory. I'll keep the fire going warm for you. You have yourself a very good sleep.